Brandon, we're back.
We're back
Had
after
a
a week
week off.
hiatus.
That's right. We 1 week off, but back at it because I was gone at what's called a churchwide assembly, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. What in the world is a churchwide assembly? What does this mean? Again, welcome to another episode of All Questions Considered. I'm Pastor Drew Ingram here with my friend Brandon Hill, and we're creating a space to engage our curiosity, to sit in the discomfort of kind of the unknown, and to learn to just enjoy the questions themselves. And tonight, we're going to talk about what is a churchwide assembly. This thing that I went to last week. We both come from different streams of the Christian tradition. And this is something that's been a part of my denomination and my life, and it looks different in all kinds of different ways of the church. So we're gonna talk a little bit about it tonight.
Yeah, I'm excited to ask you questions because, like you said, I come from a different stream, and this idea of a churchwide assembly is completely foreign to me. So I don't even know exactly where to begin tonight. So I'm excited to see if anybody has questions they want to write in a comment, and any of the questions that you want to share, I'll ask those to Drew, and we can get to know what a churchwide assembly even is. What were you doing last week, basically?
Yeah. So I'll start with that question, right? Like, what did I do last week?
Yeah.
Last week, I went to Columbus, Ohio, and attended the ELCA, my denomination, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America's 16th churchwide assembly. And so I gathered with about 900 other voting members of the assembly. I think we ended up with like 830, 840 voting members, and a handful of other visitors and guests and support staff and volunteers and people just coming to see what's going on. We gathered at the convention center in Columbus, Ohio, and to worship together, to make decisions for our church body. And so the churchwide assembly, what it is the highest legislative authority of my denomination. It
Now,
is,
the assembly, you said the churchwide assembly is the highest. Is that everyone who is there, or all the voting members who are there?
The voting members of that assembly are
Okay.
the highest legislative authority of the church, which now you're like, Pastor Drew, you're mixing politics and religion already. Come on now. But that's the best way that I can define what that is. Like, we can make decisions for the denomination and the church-wide body as this collective of voting members put together for this church-wide assembly, which right now happens every 3 years.
Okay.
Early in our denomination's life, it happened every 2 years.
Hmm.
But since 2013, it's been every 3. And so we hadn't been together since 2019. And also, when we make decisions on like a budget, it's a 3-year budget cycle. Like, we approved a budget from now through 2025, which is in some ways kind of silly and crazy and wild. And so there's a smaller group that makes decisions on behalf of the church in the meantime, in the interim. We call them the council, like churchwide council. And there are 33 members of that, plus sort of another sort of advisory member from our bishops. So there's, in the meantime, and every year, members from the 65 synods come together. Our bishops, our vice presidents, who are our highest lay elected people, gather together. Our bishops gather together, but the one that can make decisions in the interim is really the church council. But we elect leaders for the church. We elected a new vice president for the denomination. Again, the highest elected lay person leader in the denomination was elected this last week. And we made some decisions about changes that the church is going to make or pursue, or potential changes that it might make. and all sorts of different stuff like that. So yeah, it's we make decisions, we worship together, we only come together every once in a while, and we're elected to be there.
So who elects you?
Yeah. So there are 65, the way my denomination is structured, there are 65 synods, is what we
So,
call them.
okay, what is a
Yeah.
synod?
A synod is a geographically based grouping
Okay, so it's like
of
a
churches.
region.
It is like a region. And we're broken down into 65 of them, and there's about, anywhere from 80 to 100, 180 churches in a geographic grouping. Some of them are smaller, some of them are bigger. So like there are a lot of Lutherans, a lot of ELCA Lutherans in the Twin Cities in Minnesota.
Hmm.
And so like there is a separate synod for Minneapolis and for St. Paul.
Huh.
But southwestern Texas, from this side of El Paso County, from south of Waco down to the Rio Grande Valley, all the way over to Corpus Christi and things, almost
Oh,
up to
wow.
halfway up to Galveston. That's all one synod
So
down
much
here in
less
Texas.
dense Lutheran population here than the Twin Cities.
Yeah, and
Interesting.
so our synods vote for us to go. The
Okay.
only people that go from every synod, no matter what, are our bishop and our vice president, who are also elected positions, but they're elected to terms, and they get automatic vote at these churchwide assemblies. So every synod sends their bishop, their vice president, and then a handful of other voting members, 8 to 10 other voting members, get elected to come be
Gotcha.
there.
So you
And
were elected to go.
I was elected to go in 2021. I was elected to come to this 2022 churchwide assembly.
Wow. So out of a it sounds like dozens and dozens of churches that make up your synod, you were one of how many people to get to go to this?
We had a group of, it ended up being 9 voting members, would have been 10. We had somebody who couldn't make it toward the end, and we couldn't find somebody to fill in for them. But
Gotcha. Well, it sounds like it's a pretty it's a responsibility on one hand, but it's also an honor to be elected to go represent and vote for your synod. Um,
yeah,
so like
and,
when do you suspect the next time you'll even be able to do this is like how often will you get elected?
it's a tricky thing, right? So this was my second one to go to. It's the third
Okay.
time I've been elected to be a voting member. The first time I was elected was 2009. I was a youth voting member.
Uh,
So I was maybe 17 when I got elected, and would have been like 18 when I was going. But I got sick and couldn't make it.
uh,
In 2011, I was the young adult voting member, which means between 18 and 30 when I was elected. And I
uh,
did get to go to Orlando. And then this is my first time going this round. The way voting members are broken down, certain percentage lay, certain percentage clergy. The whole assembly, when it meets together, it isn't supposed to be more than 40% clergy.
okay.
So at least 60%. 60% or more of the people voting are supposed to be lay people, not clergy. Um, so there's limited spots. The clergy ones can sometimes be pretty contested. I think maybe there were 3 or 4 people on the ballot when I got elected.
Uh,
Um, a lot of the layperson ones aren't very highly contested,
oh
and
yeah.
some of that's just like people don't know what's going on. It's hard to understand. Um, it's you have to be invested in the church in a different way than a lot of people are in their local congregation. Um, and it can be this really foreign thing, like we're talking about tonight, right? Like
Yeah.
what is this? Why? What do you mean? Legislative decisions and assembly and
Yeah,
all of
so
that.
I grew up in a non-denominational church. So we basically defined ourselves by not being a part of something like this. That was our
Right.
title, was non-denominational. We don't do assemblies. Nobody else kind of has any governing control over. So this is very different and foreign to me. Like the highest level of organized governance was just like there was like a church board, the senior leadership. So this idea of people traveling all over the country to come to a place to make decisions together and to vote. So tell me about what is the role of this, the importance of this? Why do y'all do? What do you think is the benefit and health of doing this? Because in some ways, I could see it being very cumbersome and having to vote for so many. But what do you see as being the importance and role and health of doing this, this church assembly and running as a denomination that's making decisions together?
Sure. Yeah, and what I will say is this, the way that this functions is not unlike, like, at every level of the church, at the national or the churchwide denominational level, at the synodical level, at the synod level, and at the congregational level, it looks kind of the same. Like, there's some staff leadership, pastors or bishops and their staff. There is a council that
Mm,
makes decisions sort of in the interim, of kind of board, and then on occasion, once a year and more as needed, or at the churchwide level, once every 3 years, um, we come together in a larger representative body.
mm,
Um, I think that a couple things, right? The gift of a denomination is, you think about all the good that the healthiest of congregations can be doing. You think about magnifying that, you know, to the nth degree, right? You're talking about thousands of churches and millions of people, and so one, you get this sense of like, what does it actually mean to be part of a bigger church?
mm,
And how do you really be in relationship together? It's messy. When we have to organize our life together, turns out we like look at things like constitutions and bylaws and memorials and continuing resolutions, and how do we take collective action together, and what does it take to listen to each other and come to these points that we can say this is who we are as the church,
mm,
not just our congregation. That's, I mean, it can be messy and difficult to do and a long process just in a congregation, but to recognize like, oh, it's even bigger than that, right? And then I would say it's even bigger than a denomination when we say we're
mm,
trying to be church together. But in a real practical way, it means, okay, well, how do we organize our life together? How do we go about this work? So that, because the beautiful thing is the ELCA, even as is not like the biggest denomination, or group of Christians in the country. 1 in 50 people in the U.S. is a beneficiary of a Lutheran services program, whether that's our World
wow.
Hunger or our disaster response, or our border ministry, Amparo, or Lutheran social services and adoption and foster care and things. Like 1 in 50 people interfaces with one of these programs. We also, it's not directly under our denomination, but our denomination helps start the second, largest settler of refugees in the country, Lutheran
Mm,
Immigration and Refugee Services, and you can't do that from just one local space,
yeah.
right? From no matter how big that congregation gets, like we're talking about things that are coordinating, like every time you get floods and fires and the freeze in Texas, like we're deploying people and volunteers to meet immediate needs, right off the bat at this, wide scale, both domestically and abroad as a denomination. We're also able to, like one day of the assembly, one afternoon, we received ecumenical and interreligious guests. So our last episode was about interfaith relationships, right? And we talked about like the very personal nature of some of those. I mean, we had there's a shoulder to shoulder campaign that's been going on for to point out and combat anti-Muslim bias and prejudice in the
Mm,
country for the last decade plus, for the last really almost 2 decades. And so we had a rabbi and an imam that we've worked closely with, from the National Islamic Society of North America. One of the head imams was there to and says, thank you for your bishop and for your church's commitment to helping to work on this. We hope that this is, the future path we can go down together. Um, we were able to, as a church, sort of try and reckon with the harm done to Alaska Native and American Indian people in this country, to Indigenous persons. And we offered an official apology and commitment with steps on what our church is going to do to try and repent and repair. Um, we were able to kind of make these recognitions, and how much more. Now they have to, like, I guess the hard part is trying to make what happens there be expressed locally too, right? Um,
Yeah.
but we wouldn't be able to interface at that level and degree. Like our presiding bishop, she's had a visit with the Pope to talk about Lutheran Catholic relationships in North America.
Hmm.
We wouldn't be able to, like, the Pope's not going to see me and talk about Lutheran Catholic relationships in North America. And what that looks like. So we're able to do a lot of that kind of stuff, as cumbersome as it is. And
Yeah.
in fact, one of the things, one of the first actions the assembly took together says, hey, we probably need to relook at our constitution, maybe even with a blank slate, because we've been together for 35 years. We thought we were a church of 5 million members going towards 8 million. Turns out we went down towards 3.5 million, and we're maybe still going down. Is this the best way to organize ourselves? The world has changed. Do we need
Hmm.
to start from a blank slate? Can we get through this with just amendments and things? And also then say, but constitutions don't save the church, right? And constitutions and bylaws are not the future of the church, but they're important to how we live our life together, which is
Yeah.
important to the future of the church.
Really interesting when you mention numbers like 1 in 50 people are impacted by this body of people. The Lutheran denomination, and I mean 1 in 50. That's, you're talking about numbers bigger than giant companies like Airbnb. Like more, that's like more impact, more people interfacing with Lutherans than like Uber and things like that.
Yeah.
So that's pretty impressive. And I'm curious for you, what do you like, or what do you hope about being connected to this larger body? What is for you the thing that kind of, like last week, I'm curious if there's anything that stands out as something that you're like, gosh, this is why I love being a part of something that kind of reaches this wide. This is some of the benefit and health of being connected and staying to, because it's interesting. You're mentioning like this is part of the work of doing something at this level. And it's interesting the different levels that we can and we do fracture at. Like at some level, you
Mm,
say we are Lutheran, which is one level of
sure.
fracturing or denominating and or dividing and defining yourselves. And so it's like there's Christian, which is at one level of defining and dividing. There's denominations, and there's synods and churches and congregations. And but I'm curious for you participating in something like that. What were some of the ways that you're like, this is why we take the time, the cumbersome time, the sometimes bureaucratic time to do this kind of thing?
Yeah, great question. Um, I mean, I think we were able to model what it looks like to really listen to each other. We were
Hmm.
able to have conversation about, like, what actually does matter most for the church moving forward. Um, we're able to, uh, act in a way that has real impact and sort of public space. We've talked about a little bit through our previous episodes, right? Of like who has the public conversation on what it means to be a Christian,
Hmm.
and what those values are, and to watch our denomination sort of lean into our theology and our theological grounding, to then come forward and say, and this is what that looks like right now.
Hmm.
So committing to both advocate for and try and embody uh, significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions in line with what climate scientists are saying. To say that, like, hey, remember Genesis 1:26, when God creates humanity, before God even creates humanity, like before they actually show up, he says, I give you charge and care over the creation here, right? Like
Hmm.
our foundational vocation at creation is, at our own creation, is caring for the totality of God's creation, one another, and the land and things. And so how do we do that? Um, we added into our provisions that any congregation or institution of the church that closes ought to at least add into its possibilities for what it does with that land, is giving it back to the native peoples who
Hmm.
once
Wow.
had charge of it. Um, And again, we can't direct each congregation to do that, but we've said, hey, we ought to at least stop and think about this very seriously, and uh, and be able to take that. So it's, it's bureaucratic, and in some ways, then it's like, well, but also we still let a lot of congregations, or we let congregations to, for the most part, decide what they want to do, um, and encourage and provide resources for and connect. And I get to come back to my congregation and say, this is what we as the church, this is what you are doing, even though you aren't, interfacing with 1 in 50 people, you are,
Hmm.
right? Which is a really beautiful reminder of, this work is not up to us. Um, Being the body of Christ together means more than me, more than what I do, more than what even just like a handful of us or a few hundred of us do. Um, this is a way that we can embody that work. And then it's a beautiful thing to come together in really wonderful and diverse ways of worship. It also was interesting for us, this assembly, and some of that is by intention, and we're finally seeing it maybe pay off a little bit. I talked about there's restrictions on what percentage of the voting members are clergy and lay, but we also say like this percentage should be male, this percentage should be female, and now our provisions leave kind of an open 10% for people who don't fit into a gender binary,
Hmm.
when we're making up our assemblies and voting members. And then these people should be young, right? Like every synode's supposed to bring a youth and a young adult, at least two people under 30. Um, and we're trying to be more diverse. We elected a new vice president, and the top three people were from incredibly diverse backgrounds, and not necessarily lifelong Lutherans, but
Hmm.
found the beauty of a Lutheran theology of grace and theology of the cross, um, and uh, and yeah, and so it's kind of neat to be together in that public way, in that larger way, to come out with some hope for. Um, yeah, there's some death going on, and there's some dire needs going around, but um, where our hope and trust is in a God who brings life from death. And so what does it mean to um, give what we have, give everything we've got for love of neighbor? Um,
Hmm. What do you for the Lutheran denomination or the ELCA? What binds y'all together in commonality that makes you unique as ELCA members? And how much diversity do you feel in that context? Like, is there quite different diverse, especially when it comes to theology? Um, how much is there like we are all in sync as ELCA as Lutherans, and how much is there different diversity of like we're arguing about how we should view and act on these
yeah.
things?
Well, if people haven't picked up a little bit from me, we like to bring we like to have good honest conversation and kind of hash those things out. So I don't, the church is not of one mind on a lot of things, and in fact, even some of our church sort of documents and social statements leave space for a variety of positions, for diverse views, and say, hey, in considering scripture and theology and prayer, we might come to different conclusions sort of in this zone. What tends to unite us even in that, right? If it's like, hey, we, good, well-meaning people of faith might read scripture and come to a different conclusion on this particular issue. Where we land is love God and love neighbor. So then, what are the implications for how we act? Well, regardless of whether um, of sort of your let me see if I can pick a good one, right? Like healthcare, right? Regardless of if you are going to come to the conclusion that the Christian thing is full universal healthcare for everybody, because Jesus healed people for free, right? Like somebody could read scripture and be like, well, Jesus heals people for free, so nobody should be asking for copays, nobody should ever have to pay for this, right? And then other people are like, well, it still kind of costs something, and my pocketbook's not as big as God's is, and and there are stories in scripture where people are paying for people's care. Like even the
Mm.
Good Samaritan is like paying to make sure that the person that he's
Mm.
picked up off the road is being taken care of, right? So you might come to different conclusion on like, well, how much should we pay? It's affordable, but where we would then come in common out of that is to say, but everybody should get good health care, and we ought to be doing insurance, like regardless of how it's being paid for. If somebody's life is at stake, we ought to be leaning into caring for our neighbor and their life together. In the same way, even with like immigration, like it's like we might have differences on policy, but we ought to be caring for the immigrants and figuring out a policy that doesn't dehumanize people and lead people to death, like leave people for dead. And that's, I would say at when we're at our best, the thing that we're holding in common is God's grace has been freely given to us, and has set us free to freely love our neighbor, and regardless of who that neighbor is and what that neighbor thinks or believes or acts like, and knowing that sometimes that love will look a little different in different circumstances. And sometimes the best sermon to a hungry person is a slice of bread, right? Like, um and so I would say that in terms of the questions of our diversity, I think there's more diversity of thought than there is like diversity of skin color and ethnicity, though we're working on it. And like I said,
Mm.
this assembly was in a lot of ways really neat because it can feel like, and I think the reality by our like total numbers is we are still a very white, pretty old, like in age, denomination, and there were a lot of younger and more diverse people in this assembly who really love and care for the church, who are willing to come sit through like learning Robert's Rules of Order. And are we voting on the amendment to the amendment? And now we're voting to end discussion, but am I actually voting on the amendment or am I voting to end discussion? And now I voted on the amendment, but what about the motion? Now I have to vote on the actual motion. And now we amended this motion, but I have to vote. Do I want the motion to come to the floor? Or do I want the substitute motion to come to the floor? And like, it's gnarly. It's nuts. It's like Robert's Rules of Order. If anybody sat in a really big meeting like that, is crazy. And it's meant to try and give everybody a voice. But I'm sitting here next to the youth voting member from our Senate is sitting with me, and my wife at our voting member table. And we're like trying to keep each other on track. And it was fun because by the end of the week, this 17-year-old who didn't know anything about Robert's Rules before, he's like, no, I think actually we're on this. And I'm like, oh, you're right. Yeah. Because it's just like, even as somebody who knew some of the most of that stuff coming in, it's hard to follow if you're not paying a lot of
Yeah,
attention.
I can't imagine. Goodness. Okay, I'm curious. Well, one, if for those tuning in, want to ask Drew any questions about what is a churchwide assembly, what he was at last week with 1,000 ELCA members making decisions and voting on the denomination and the direction. But I'm curious, what are some of your highlights from last week? Some of your top 1, 2 takeaways, highlights of I don't know what's still floating in your
Yeah,
head, or things that you guys voted on.
sure.
Tell me some favorite things.
I think a few different things. One, in terms of just like fantastic speakers, whether that was at the assembly or during worship. The two that like their words are still ringing in my ears. Uh, there was a rabbi. Well, I need to look up. Let me get her name. But she had a fantastic address to our assembly. Um, Here we go. Rabbi Laterman. She had a fantastic address, calling us. One of the more beautiful things she shared at the end was, let us become the ancestors that our future needs. It's just this kind of like, what does it mean in the crux of this moment in history and life? How are we called to do that? And as interfaith and interreligious partners, moving forward and thinking about the all of the stuff of our society, what it means to live in America right now, right? I think that was great. I think Bishop Patricia Davenport, she preached the final sermon. She is fantastic. That's Patricia. That's Bishop Davenport. She's great. I said I kind of felt my call to ministry again in that sermon. It was a powerful word. And you can actually go watch some of those videos and things that have been recorded. In terms of assembly action, things that the assembly brought forth, probably the three that will cause the biggest change or immediate action that kind of there were important things brought to the floor that a lot of it was talking about stuff or reaffirming previous decisions that are important again in this time. So in a post Roe v. Wade world, we're reaffirming that everybody is deserving of love and pastoral care, regardless of what decisions they make about their health care. And like we have a social statement about that from 1993, I think is either 91 or 93. But sort of reaffirming it, and that was an important thing to bring to the floor in the
just saying
in the
that you
current
still
circumstance.
stand by something
Yeah,
that has been stated before, but feels like it needs to be restated again
right.
in this
But
climate.
the three that probably are going to cause the biggest shift in the church in the next few years. One I talked about already. We voted to explore reconstituting the denominations. So there will be a task force who, over the next 3 years, will make a recommendation on whether or not the ELCA should hold a reconstituting convention, should kind of start from scratch in the way that we organize ourselves. And that's a really big deal and a big task, and it'll probably take a lot of money, and we'll gather
it's like
ideally.
wipe the whiteboard clean kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. The ELCA has outlasted. It was formed out of three major Lutheran denominations coming together, merging together. The ALC, the LCA, and the AELC merged, and but the ELCA is now older than most of those predecessor bodies were. Like they had gone through their own kind of forms to get to that spot. And so, how much of a look can we get? Can we get the structural change that we need with constitutional amendments, or do we need to redraft the Constitution? So that's the exploration. That's a big one. That's a really big one. It also made it a little bit hard when we were talking about constitutional amendments later in the week to be like, how much does this matter? Like how much does the wording in this one part of our Constitution
might all get
matter?
wiped clean. The whole Etch a Sketch might get shaken up in the next several years.
Yeah.
So what would make the denomination decide we might want to start over in some ways? What would lead to that?
I think there's a couple things. I think like I said, the kind of the imagined division from 1987, 88 is we're a big church getting bigger. We got smaller. Does that mean we need to organize ourselves differently? Is it more helpful? Also, we came from three different church bodies, so there's a lot of compromises made between the way those three church bodies had their own structure set up and polity and constitutions. We kind of tried to blend them in a way, and was that the most helpful thing? In some ways, maybe yes. In some ways, probably not. And then there are a couple of maybe like inciting incidents in the last year. One of which is in the Sierra Pacific Synod of our denomination, which is Oregon and Northern California, parts of Oregon and Northern California. There was some. There was a big mess without getting into too many details that would be kind of hard to describe in this episode of this show.
Now you're making us curious.
Bishop had misconduct, the bishop removed somebody for allegations of misconduct, but did it in a way that was insensitive to the community, that was insensitive culturally to Latina community. That was the bishop removed their pastor on the feast day of the Virgin of Guadalupe, which was just like, what are you thinking? Even if it's the right thing to do, it was done in the wrong way. Even if it was the needed thing to do, it was not handled well. It was not handled well afterwards. And so we publicly apologized to that community and said hey, that's not the way that the church should have handled this. situation. We were ignorant of the cultural things at play. We then kind of left them hanging. Like that same synodical bishop didn't give them a new pastor.
Hmm.
So they just have been like, we're worshiping in a parking lot because they didn't have any more rental agreements.
Okay.
Um, and
So how
so,
does this
so
connect to the
the,
Constitution?
sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
So technically the bishop that did all of this, I don't think that they that they did anything that went against the Constitution.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
But they did, but like it was like clear that the actions were wrong.
Hmm.
Um and handled really poorly. But so there's a couple of like different things of our structure is weird because in a lot of ways bishops have very little power to actually like mandate and do things. And then there are a few ways where it seems like bishops have almost unchecked power.
Hmm.
Um, and uh, and it's kind of trying to shore up some of those holes, right? So if this happened and it caused this pain and hurt, um, and maybe was like altogether just like wrong, but it was allowed by our own governing documents, then maybe we need to look at our governing documents,
Gotcha. So
right?
there's been
Like
a few
maybe
instances.
there's some systemic racism in our structure itself that we need to take a
Hmm.
fresher look at. Um, and so there are a couple of kind of inciting issues in that sense that I think led to part of this too, to say, what would it look like to have more diverse voices in that exploration to reconstitute, um, and uh, and to take a to build something that's not necessarily steeped in, for lack of better terms, like a culture of whiteness, and white privilege.
Yeah. Okay. I love it. So I'll go ahead and ask you maybe one more question here,
Yeah.
unless anybody else has any other questions you want to write in the comments or chat. We'll make time for maybe one of those if we've got any other questions. I'm curious for the Churchwide Assembly. And you might have already hit on this a little bit, but what is y'all's goal in gathering together as a denomination, but specifically at the Churchwide Assembly? What is the what is the touchdown? What is the end zone that everyone's like, this is what we're heading for this week-long assembly slash for our denomination? How do we know we're succeeding? How
Yeah.
do we know when we're failing? What are we all in this together for?
So a lot of that stuff gets set. So actually, like I mentioned, some of the climate action that we took, which is also one of those big ones that's going to change what the church does. But like some of the language that was approved by this assembly says our church-wide organization should set for itself this goal to reduce its net greenhouse gas pollution by 50% by 2030, and to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. So like that's one thing we are committing as a church to do, and that will then be a goal that gets and like included in the action we ask is like, and you'll report back to us in 3 years at the next
Mm,
churchwide assembly, and you'll do this to share what you're doing. So there are kind of some specific goals that a lot of which have come from ourselves, or then like the office of our presiding bishop, the head bishop of the church, and their staff, her staff are like they come up with goals like you would expect any kind of head of staff, head of organization, CEO type position, president to do. So there are goals from that framework, right? Like what does this look like? So one of ours right now is as a denomination to engage 1 million new, young, and diverse people with the
mm,
good news of Jesus Christ. And so we talked a lot. We talked a bit about that, and the office of the bishop presented that, and there's some ideas on how to do that. And I would say it's wrapped into some of our other stuff. Like for me, some of the why should we care so much about the climate right now? In addition to a million ways, theological ways, reasons, and all of this kind of stuff, it's like it's also in line with that goal. Like everything tells us that young people care a whole lot about the climate. Like people are leaving other jobs in droves to go to climate conscious jobs or jobs about the
mm,
climate, because a lot of young people have realized like, hey, yeah, if there's no earth in 30 years, or if the earth is uninhabitable to people in 30 years, what's the point of anything else, right? um So there's a bunch of stuff like that that's kind of being tried to align. I would say, in a general sense, the assembly is there to do some of the business of the church. I would say it's a twofold work. So the work of the church, and the work of the assembly, budgets, electing a vice president, right? Who are our leaders? So in some years, like in 3 years, it will be electing a bishop, presiding bishop, and people to serve in these leadership roles. It will be being together to listen to what the church is doing, to give some feedback, and to get energized to try and move together as one church, to remember that we are this larger body and connected. So that we do that kind of work. And then I would say the other work we do together is the work of the people, the liturgy, to be in worship together, drawn all from 65 different geographic areas, across North America, because even a few not United States territories have churches and people there. So yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of that twofold work, in that sense of, to remember who we are as church, together, what the core part of what it means to be the ELCA right now is, um, and yeah. So, but I would kind of, the way I've been talking about it with my congregation a lot is that twofold work, right? Like, we came for this work, budgets and vice presidents and elections, and the goals that we're setting for ourselves and things. And we came for this work to be together in worship, to be turned again to Christ, to be bound to one another, to remember that we're part of this larger body of Christ, and this kind of Lutheran tribe, Lutheran stream of the Christian tradition, of the followers of Jesus, and what does that mean and look like right now? But to remember that we are together in it.
I love it. It's so foreign and different than my experience of church, being from a non-denominational background, and I can see the beauty of trying to do the hard work of being united together at that level. Like, every level you go up, there's just new complexity, new, it's more cumbersome, like you said. But to value it enough to do that, to wade through the messiness of it, and to have, what is it, Robert's rules of
Robert's Rules of Order, yeah, is
okay.
like, so. I mean, it's the same stuff that, like, most of our government runs on,
Okay, yeah.
right? So, like, if you're in like in a legislative session, or if my dad talks about it from working for the Cancer Society in a large nonprofit, when they get in these big meetings, like, got to bring a motion to the floor. There's rules about what that motion has to be stated like. It needs a second. Then it goes to discussion. You can't talk about the motion before you make the motion. You have to make the motion before you, like. But because it's messy to run a meeting with 1,000 people in the room,
Yeah.
right?
I've never had a meeting that large to, you know, I've always been in meetings, especially in church, that are small enough to, you can just kind of interject or raise your hand. So,
Hmm.
um, there's part of me that would probably be pulling my hair out in something like that. And then there's another part of me that says, this is beautiful. This is worthwhile. And I'm so glad that you guys are doing this.
It's both,
Um,
is the
yeah.
answer.
Yeah, I love it. I love it so much. Well, anything else you want to share about Churchwide Assembly, about your week last week before we wrap
Yeah.
up?
Oh no, that's most of it. I will say, you asked, are we of one mind theologically and stuff? There was actually one of the other big actions that was taken, was to reevaluate one of our church's social statements on human sexuality, from that was adopted in 2009, but it uses this language that comes from our theology called bound conscience, and like, so we're going to hire new theological staff to help lead a review process of, is that actually something that's core to our theology? Are we understanding and articulating this in the right way? And what does that look like? So, it's interesting to see that action taken on, like, uh, climate stuff, reconstituting, examining closely, and gathering these panels of a diverse group of minds and people, to talk about a core piece of our theology as it plays out in our life, in our kind of ethics and social practice and messaging. it's exciting to see that stuff happen. It's hopeful to see people willing to engage in that stuff and not just say, "Oh, we're set in our ways. That's the way we've always done it." A lot of this action was passed like, kind of overwhelmingly within the 80s and 90% of votes, to one side for a lot of the motions and actions. Um, I went in wondering, and I think the early days of the assembly like held this tension of like, are we like, what are we doing here? Right. Like we knew that there was going to be this like motion to reconstitute. We kind of didn't know where everybody landed on it. And and you're like, yeah, how do people feel about the next steps of the church? And I left, and so did a lot of my colleagues, feeling enlivened and
Mm.
hopeful. And that was a really beautiful thing, even in the midst of long meetings and weird rules and hard things to come through. The feeling coming out of it was excitement and hope
Yeah.
for what the next bit looks like. And that's really neat. And that is one of those difficult things of being in a denomination, is it like on that other end of like, yeah, this is big and cumbersome, and is this useful or not useful? Um, and to tie it to another one of our episodes, I'm sure that in this reconstituting convention, we'll have that discussion of like, is it worth having evangelical in the name of this denomination right now, right?
Yeah.
Based on what it means to most people, and versus what it means to us, and and how different we are from what most people think of as evangelical. Um, in this country in these years. Um, so yeah, I don't know. Right? It was fun to see all of that kind of stuff connecting. It was great to be with friends new and old, and to kind of get that spark of hope that the the rhythm of death and resurrection is ongoing. Right?
Mm.
That we are. As Lutherans, we like to say we're semper reformata. We're always a church, always being reformed and made
Mm.
new. And it's like, no, that's like actually happening now.
Mm.
And I do have some confidence that it's at least in some of these ways won't just be kind of lip service or small
Yeah.
steps, but a few big things going.
And reforming together, not reforming by fracturing and people breaking off to do their own. And I feel like that's so significant in today,
Mm,
with how much I feel like we're becoming polarized, and not just to two sides, but to 1,000 different sides. And we can all kind of figure out our own little thing, what we believe, how we want to practice, how I want to live, how I want to design my life in a way that's more and more individualistic, more and more isolated, more and more fractured, and not really connected to something larger, especially a group of people with a common mission and trying to find you. So the hard work of doing that in unity and doing it together seems really significant today. So I love hearing that. I don't even know if I would sign up to be a part of something because of all the other things that come with it, but it just seems really significant that, and I'm so glad that you guys are modeling that and how to do that. So yeah, I love it, Drew. Thanks so much for
yeah.
sharing.
Yeah, folks, if you have more questions about what in the world a church-wide assembly is, here I'm gonna flash a couple other pictures. Like here, like here's the assembly hall. We just sat around tables for hours at a time.
Table
Um,
8D.
yeah, yeah, exactly. We gathered in worship with all kinds of different types of leadership and communities and things.
I
And
love the garb.
yes, and it was a beautiful time to be together. If you got more questions, share them with us. Ask them. If you got questions not about this topic, but you want to leave them with us, please do. That's how we're getting topics for some future episodes and things. And then I know we've been plugging it for a little bit now, but I promise you, like Brandon and I were in a room together filming yesterday some of these videos on faith and parenting
Yeah.
that we hope to share with you in not too long. So if you got any questions on faith and parenting, or if you want to be open to having a resource to start some discussion, and we'll probably be plugging a Facebook group really soon if you want to get in to be able to have that conversation with folks in a little more closed space than just being in the live chat on a show like this. That stuff's coming your way soon. And then the last maybe announcement I have in this for tonight is we're gonna. This is not to distance ourselves from Spirit in the Hills and stuff, but just it might be easier for you folks to find us if we're more in one place rather than being everywhere. So you might see that transition over the next few weeks. At the very least, there will be an All Questions Considered Facebook page and YouTube channel dedicated that are bringing this stuff out in the same way that you can catch the audio version of the podcast every week on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, just to make sure that it's easier for folks to find, and you can kind of have a couple or one kind of direct place to go to find some of this stuff. I miss anything?
No, I love it, man. All that's left is to sign off with our weekly thing of don't ask a dumb question.
No,
is that how it goes?
Come
is
on.
That how it goes?
Yeah. No, though I do. I would be curious, friends, if I want you to tell me, like, you could leave in the comments of any episode what the best question you've ever been asked, or like what makes a good question, or these things. But no, we'll sign off. Ask a good question.
There it is. There it is. Ask a good question. All right. Thank you, Drew.
Grace and peace, everyone.